live? Okay, I guess we're on live and we ought to get started.
Okay, let's do that.
I want to take a look at that article.
You sure can.
Afterwards, I want to.
Okay.
I was trying to, I remember reading one time and we
That's
couldn't
it.
find it again.
Good morning. Welcome to the almost vacant Platteville Senior Center. We're going to try our first Facebook Live presentation here today. It'll be Dick Greeney and Terry Burns talking about John Dillinger and his connection to Platteville. So Terry, I'll turn it over to you.
Okay. It's all right for me to sit down here, right?
Yeah.
Okay, so I think the way we're going to do this is I'm going to start out as the mouth and Dick is the brains here. And I'll go through these first few slides, but hi to whoever is out there. And so this is what we're going to be talking about, John Dillinger's Platteville connection, which is attorney Louis Pickett. Is this on? Hold on. It's not on. There. Try this again. Okay, so that is a picture of Louis Pickett at John Dillinger's arraignment in Crown Point, Indiana. If you are tuning in here, you maybe know a fair amount about John Dillinger. We're going to talk more about Louis Pickett. And so there he is. And if you want to know more about this, by the way, Dennis Wilson, who many of you know, has written a couple really good blog posts on this and an article that's on the Grant County Historical Society website, which is down right now, but I understand is going to be going back up soon. He wrote that back in 2016. So for those of you that are here, we've got some copies of that article if you're interested. And there's another picture of Attorney Pickett. Here is, of course, John Dillinger from the FBI website, which I figured I ought to attribute at the bottom since it's the FBI website. But he was a quite colorful character, and if we have time, we'll go through some of the stories about Dillinger, but our focus, again, is more on the Platteville connections. Let me get my transcript here. Here are some mugshots of various people in the Dillinger gang. Up there on the top row, left to right, is Charles Mackley, sometimes called Fat Charles. The guy in the middle there, Herman Carl Lamb, sometimes called Baron Lamb, the father of American bank robbery, was actually born in Germany. And so when Dillinger was arrested as a young man and in prison, he met a lot of the people in the Dillinger gang, as some of you probably know, in prison. And although it seems kind of primitive now, because a lot of us have grown up with crime TV and that kind of thing, Lamb was the father of American bank robbery because we get terms from him like casing the joint and that kind of thing. He thought it should be like a military operation, and he taught these kind of things to Dillinger when Dillinger was in prison. Over on the far right is Homer Van Meter, who actually is the person that eventually caused Attorney Pickett to go to jail for harboring fugitives. Down here on the bottom is Russell Booby Clark, and then over there is Harry Pierpont. Pierpont, Dick, I believe you said he was sort of the most brutal of the bunch, or that was his reputation.
Yeah, he ended up getting the electric chair.
And so Dillinger apparently was the mediator of the whole bunch. There are other folks associated with the Dillinger gang, like Babyface Nelson here, who was responsible for killing more FBI agents than any other person. And over there is Scarface Al Capone, who had some connection to hiding out in this area also. And if we were looking at Wisconsin connections rather than just Platteville connections, we'd look at Billy Frechette, who was born up on the Menominee Reservation and was arrested before Dillinger wound up hiding out down here, but was supposedly the love of his life, or at least that for a couple of months, the way the Dillinger story goes. So this is how we wound up doing this presentation. Alan and I were with Dick and Lori on a road trip, which is some of the most fun we have had recently. And we went out to Red School Road, and that's where Dick's mom used to teach. There's not a school there, although there's Dick sitting on some of the kind of playground equipment you're not allowed to have on playgrounds anymore. And so he pointed out, oh, look across the road there. Do you know what that is? Or kind of kitty corner across. And this was, and to my surprise, he said, well, that's the mine where Dillinger was hanging out, the so-called Big Dick mine. And there used to be a hoist house and some other things out there. So we'll circle back around to that shortly here. At the time when most of this story is taking place is 1934. So John Dillinger is the most wanted man in the country. He's atop of the FBI most wanted list. And his attorney is Pickett. So the Telegraph-Herald actually really broke the story about, to make it, well, let me back up. Dick and I think, decided, since there are lots of really interesting Dillinger stories, but who knows if all of them are true, you know, like there's one about him handing out money to people at a bank down in Potosi, and there's stuff like this, but if you actually look for the record of it, who knows? And it's not my place to say whether some of these happened or not, so we've tried to stick to things that there is some evidence that happened, or at least were told by someone whose name we can tie it to. Well, the Telegraph-Herald did this whole story, and it seems when there were government agents all hanging around in this area, the Telegraph-Herald also had reporters hanging around watching the agents, watching for the crime. And so the Telegraph-Herald story, which I'll send clips of to Bill Kramer to put on the Historic Images site, it was the one picked up by AP. So all the other stories that broke around this time were coming from the Telegraph-Herald. Near the end of this presentation, we'll be back to their story about the mine south of town and Dillinger hiding out in that mine and almost certainly finding out about the mine from Pickett. Did that make sense to everyone who's here? Sort of stringing together a few things. So one question would be, how did Dillinger wind up in the mine? Everyone assumes it was his attorney, and there's some good reasons for assuming that. Anyway, here is the Pickett family. The older couple in the middle are his parents. We're guessing that Pickett is the second over there. He looks more like the older pictures, and I thought he had kind of a smug look on his face, but that's just an editorial comment. Anyway, this is an unattributed photo from Ancestry.com. Pickett became, as Dennis Wilson describes in his article, the kind of lawyer for the mob. I'll read a little here from Dennis's article. Dennis Wilson writes that Louis Pickett never attended law school, but now actually there's some question about that, because Lori Graney found in his Wisconsin State Journal obituary, they say there he graduated from Kent Law School in Chicago. Other articles say he attended night school, but the sources I think that Dennis Wilson is relying on say he didn't go to law school. So if somebody has extra time and wants to write the law school, maybe we could find out. Anyway, but he was an attorney in the city of Chicago's prosecutor's office. His time as a prosecutor didn't last long. He was, according to Dennis, soon part of a group of law enforcement officials who attended banquets thrown by Al Capone. And he was indicted along with a number of politicians for taking rake-offs from coal sales to city schools. He was never found guilty, and Dick Graney has looked into the story of that a bit and said, well, he was never found guilty because he was a kind of clever attorney. What he did 4 times in a row was call for a speedy trial, and the people prosecuting him weren't ready. So the last time they had to let him go because they were going for bigger people. But it was the end of his time in the prosecutor's office. And he became a defense attorney in 1922 and set up his own practice with Arthur O'Leary as his investigator. And again, to read directly from Dennis Wilson's article, Dennis writes that both men were shady and were more than willing to bend rules to make a buck. I think that's a pretty fair characterization. So he became a preferred attorney for various people associated with organized crime in Chicago. But that still doesn't answer how, you know, that's just the kind of timeline. So we looked at Ancestry.com, why not? And here's some information about Lewis Pickett. His father, well, Pickett was born in Benton, which is of course a mining country. His father was also born there, though his family came from Canada. His grandfather is listed as a retail merchant in Benton on the 1860 census. They also lived in New Diggings, which, as you know, is another big mining town. His mother was from the greater Chicago area, so that's probably his connection to Chicago. At least 2 of her siblings came to Highland in Iowa County. Her dad was from Scotland, her mother from County Limerick, Ireland, but her brother Bill Hasberg was living in Highland in 1900, and he was a zinc miner. Pickett's parents got married in Lafayette County. There was a family of 12 children. And just to continue through this, what I was looking at with some of these census records was who are the connections to mining. So you have one connection is Pickett's mother's brother, or his uncle, and his dad is listed as a blacksmith. They live on Jefferson Street. Another piece, Dick, did you find this just in the paper this morning? That
Yeah, Lori did, that Louis Pickett's dad was a very skilled horseshoer, and that he was won some awards, and that racehorse owners really sought him out to shoe racehorses.
So I'm just repeating this for Facebook. I couldn't get this uncaught quick enough to get it to you. So Dick was saying that he was he was sought out by racehorse people who raced horses. His census address is Jefferson Street. Now there's unverified stories, and I know one of them I was told recently by Gary Prohaska, and he said I could repeat it. I don't want to repeat stories where I don't have the permission to repeat it. But Gary said that once when he was younger, he was being driven around by Richard Carl. And I think the idea was to keep Gary diverted so that people could get together a surprise party for him. And what Carl did was drive him around to different places, and one was the intersection of Jefferson and Madison, which was supposedly a Dillinger hangout. So it didn't surprise me when you find that that's first where Pickett's dad lives, and then it's where Pickett's brother Joseph, who's the closest to his age, is. So Joseph Pickett is the one in the family with the connection to mining. He's listed as a zinc miner, later a superintendent of a mining company. There's a Pickett mine. Then there's a Pickett, someone here mentioned other mine, the Pickett-Clare mine? Clare Pickett mine?
The end of Major Lane down in that area.
And the end of Major Lane. The Picketts are associated with the Trago mine, and Francis Pickett was associated with the Pickett Mining Company. This might be a good place, actually, Dick, if I could hand this to you rather than at the end, because it seemed like everybody in the family but Louis was sort of a pillar of the community.
I guess there's a bad apple in every family, and Louis seems to be the one in the Pickett family. Otherwise, I know of no other. They're a well-respected family. Ray Pickett, I don't know if anybody here is old enough to remember Ray Pickett. I believe he was the Iowa Oil representative. Did he, Charlie Rudolph take over the Iowa oil distributor after Ray Pickett, I believe? Inez Pickett be Louis' sister. I guess she was, I saw where she was, I don't remember that she was a cashier at the Interstate Power Company here in town, I guess, which was the forerunner of Alliant Energy. Does anybody remember an Inez Pickett that worked at Interstate Power? And Joseph Pickett, when it was Louis, he was a year older than Louis. He must have been in the mining business. I couldn't find much on him, but he would be the father of Francis Pickett. That I believe he didn't pass away till '94, maybe. And he was, you could say, a pillar of the community. I never knew him personally. Did you know you knew Francis Pickett? I did not know that he was a partner in the opening in Pioneer Motors. He and Wilson Bolt apparently. I didn't know that. It was in Wilson Bolt's obituary that mentioned that he and Francis Pickett. So he must have been kind of a silent partner. Francis was on the hospital board. He was a life member of the Elks Club, and he and his wife sponsored a scholarship at the university. So I don't know of any Picketts in the area by that name, but I'm sure there probably maybe are some relatives. Somebody brought up maybe the Kathy Clare might be related. But,
Thank you. So I think it's a really safe assumption that Louis Pickett's knowledge of how to stash criminals away in mines, to put it, was is a family and local knowledge, and was pretty coveted by some organized crime characters, of whom Dillinger is the most famous. There's even stories, and this comes from a blog run by someone just named Kendall out of Cuba City, who were wondering if it's one of your cousin Michelle's relatives maybe. But anyway, they'd interviewed the son, now deceased, of the person who owned this Midway bar, which you recognize Midway between Tennyson and Lancaster, if I'm getting that right. Anyway, this
between Rockville and Tennyson. It must have been Paul Wolf they interviewed.
Paul Wolf, and is between Rockville and Tennyson. So this person said that the Dillinger gang regularly for a short time hung out in Midway Bar. There are also other stories reported in that Telegraph Herald article of a bar in East Dubuque, and anyone who knows what bar that was in East Dubuque, we're trying to find that out. I mean, no, I don't know if it was the Cave, but it was a bar where you could sit in poorly lit areas. That sounds like a lot of bars in East Dubuque. I'm sorry. Okay, back to Louis Pickett. Okay, so he was born in Benton, but Lori found him on the Platteville census in 1906, still living with his family. He got the 1905 census. He got married in 1906, and he's even though he lives in Chicago and shows up in multiple Chicago registries, he's buried here in Hillside Cemetery, and so is his wife Nellie. Anyone doing research on this, by the way, you run into a few red herrings, because there are two Nellie Picketts, and the one that has children is not Louis Pickett's wife. They didn't have any children. So most of the events we're going to talk about are in 1934, and just the stunning amount of things that involve Pickett and Dillinger in the first 6 months of that year. It's like, hopefully nothing that dramatic will happen to me in my entire lifetime. If so, I'll be blessed. But I won't talk through this whole Dillinger timeline because it's, you know, his story is widely available, even say on Wikipedia. But I'll just give a kind of summary of it. He was born in Indianapolis, Indiana. So was I. We're not related. And he, how do they say, he was a difficult child. He had few interests. I think they were baseball and robbing banks, and the bank robbing obviously came later. He quit school. He was an apprentice to a local machine shop. His father was worried that the big city was corrupting him and moved him to a small town. This probably gave him the knowledge of small towns because he tended to rob banks in small towns. When he was arrested for auto theft, then he joined the Navy. He deserted the Navy. He got married to a person and didn't see her much after that. And he served time in the Indiana Reformatory and State Prison. His dad thought that by having his son plead guilty, he'd get a lighter sentence, and Dillinger got a really long sentence. And it was in prison that he hooked up with some of these other guys that became part of the Dillinger gang, including Baron Lamb, the father of American bank robbery. So his father petitioned and managed to get a whole lot of signatures, got Dillinger out of prison. But when he did this, this is 1933. This is the middle of the Depression. So he's out of prison, but there's no way he's going to get a job. So he robbed his first bank in New Carlisle, Ohio. Then he just kept going. I'll shift ahead here. Here's a list of his major bank robberies before he winds up in the Lima, Ohio prison. I'm going to focus on just one of these, and that's the one in Greencastle, Indiana, since that's the one I'd heard about. And my thought here is if you're going to throw shade at small towns, throw it at a small town far away. So we will throw it at Greencastle, and since I'm from Indiana, I feel kind of safe doing that. So Greencastle, Indiana is the site of a university, and Dillinger and his gang were casing the joint, and what they learned was that on Fridays, and by the way, I think 10 of Dillinger's bank robberies were on Fridays. So they learned at Fridays the university would make their big cash deposit into the bank. They also found that the one police car was often lent to the wife of the sheriff. So basically, if the sheriff's wife was out driving the one police car, that's a good time to rob the bank on Friday when... So I mean, that was their sophisticated plan. It more reflects upon the innocence or cluelessness or what have you of folks in Greencastle. So the Dillinger gang hit the bank. There was no sheriff's car. By the time the sheriff got the car back and alerted other people, they set up roadblocks, but the Dillinger gang was on horseback and they easily got away. And you can find stories like this with some of the other bank robberies. Lori and Dick were talking about how when they went to look for the prison that where Dillinger was held in prison in Crown Point, Indiana. Do you want to tell that story, Dick?
Go ahead.
Oh, that folks there were a little touchy, you know. Well, like, how was he able to get out? And now there's stories that we'll get to that maybe Pickett gave him a wooden gun, or, and as Dennis Wilson says in his article, that's sort of a dubious story, but somehow he was able to get out of the prison there. And folks were a little touchy about it because there's sort of the implication of, you know, well, you're sort of a small town rube and you need to, well, Dillinger, after leaving Indianapolis, was in a small town. He was, one of the other things in Lamb's How to Rob a Bank was pick environments you know well and don't rob banks in your own hometown. So anyway, that's
I guess, Terry, while you're talking on that, the Dillinger posed for pictures in the sheriff's office there with Dillinger had his hand on one guy's shoulder, and here they were being held on federal charges and been extradited from Arizona, and I don't think that would go on today, the prisoners aren't handled that way today.
Well, and he didn't even, and Pickett argued successfully to not even have him in handcuffs in his, at his arraignment, which how does that happen? They also robbed some police arsenals, by the way. This isn't a 1934 picture. I don't know the year of this picture. Bill, you might, because I took it from Platteville Historic Images.
I don't know off the top of my head,
But it's the First National Bank in Platteville. And I'm going to read you another part of Dennis Wilson's article because, and Dennis takes this from one of the books on Dillinger. But on a sort of comical note, Pickett's investigator, O'Leary, found that Dillinger and Van Meter were formulating a plan to rob the banks in Platteville, which were all in the same place. So I only have one picture up here. And so they were going to do this, and Pickett kind of freaked out. To go back to reading directly here, Pickett and O'Leary drove immediately to Probasco. Probasco is a character we'll run into who does plastic surgery on Dillinger because of Pickett. Sorry to get ahead a little there. But Pickett and O'Leary drove immediately to Probasco, who's in Chicago, and that's where Dillinger is staying while he's getting some plastic surgery done, and pleaded with the two bank robbers to abandon the plan because his family and friends could be affected, and it would appear as though that he, Pickett, had cased the banks for them. So Pickett, even according to that book, said he was just not going to be Dillinger's attorney anymore if he didn't drop this plan to not to rob the Platteville Bank. So Dillinger dropped the plan, but as Pickett and his investigators left their house, Van Meter apparently glared at O'Leary and grunted, "Why don't you keep your mouth shut anyway?" So the Platteville banks weren't hit. Okay. Dillinger's gang robbed 12 different banks in the year between June 21st, 1933 and June 30th, 1934. They fled to a variety of places. Tucson, Arizona is where they were captured, but they were also like in Florida. Later they'd be in St. Paul. And after that, and they're sent to Crown Point, Indiana, Dillinger escapes. This is what gets the feds involved and G-men running around this area, because they stole a car and they crossed lines, so that violated the National Motor Vehicle Theft Act, which made it a federal offense to transport a stolen motor vehicle across the state line. Otherwise, they all would have been separate local incidents. So that first picture I showed you of Attorney Pickett was him at the arraignment then in Crown Point defending Dillinger. And as I mentioned, he successfully argued that Dillinger should be able to appear without shackles. He also helped Dillinger escape, and that's not a conclusion. Everyone agrees that there was some complicity on Pickett's part. It's not that Pickett was sent to Leavenworth for that. He was sent to Leavenworth for helping Van Meter, but anyway, all through 1934, there's all kinds of violence connected to John Dillinger, but since he's not the subject, I'm just going to skip over it and give you the assumption that he and Pickett were almost certainly in contact. There's no reason to think that Dillinger would know where various mines were to hide in, for example. So this brings us back to the Telegraph-Herald story and them hiding out in this old mine after the escape. This is a rather long story, and I don't think there's any way to read this. These clips I'll send to Bill Kramer to stick on the Platteville Historic Image site, but they did quite a bit of research. Now there was another seemingly unrelated crime where there was a wealthy St. Paul guy, Edward Brewer, who was held captive, and he was stashed in a mine. And do you want to talk about that one, or?
he was heir to the Schmidt Brewing fortune, and I believe he was a banker, and they kidnapped him and held him several accounts. One account said there was $200,000 ransom, one other account $70,000, but anyway, after they debriefed the guy, they paid the ransom and he was released, and I believe it was an offshoot of the Paul Barker gang or something that I believe had kidnapped him. And when they debriefed him, he described the place he was at, and they were almost certain that it was the same mine and the same area that Dillinger was hiding out at down by Jenkinsville.
So is it your best guess is that probably they knew of these things through Pickett, right?
Yeah, Dennis Wilson of the Historical Society of Grant County, he detailed several times where the Dillinger gang's path would have crossed with this other gang. I guess my speculation would be maybe Louis Pickett was the common denominator there, probably that other gang maybe found out about the access to these mines. This mine, this Big Dick mine, I believe only operated from 1917 to 1920, so it would have been abandoned 14 years at the time we're talking here in 1934.
And the article mentioned that it was ideal and that it had a tower that was a lookout, and it sounds like that's the hoist house of the mine, and that there were some other structures around that are no longer standing. Well, the rest of this article I'll send to Bill for anyone who wants to look at it more. But after Dillinger had been caught, they found bloody newspapers with the particular dates, so you can even nail down the dates where they were in this mine. They got out of the mine, Dillinger got back to Chicago, but then of course he was killed in Chicago. But back to Louis Pickett. So Pickett, during this same time period, was churning up a lot of local difficulties. He had violated a Securities Act in Darlington. And eventually it got, and I guess it is still to this day the biggest turnout for a trial that didn't happen in Darlington. People were waiting for Pickett's arraignment there, but he couldn't be arraigned because he had just been released under a $25,000 bond on a Dillinger charge in Chicago. So they delayed it. You were looking for how this had resolved.
I wanted to mention that you see in that article, Ivan, where David Gardner was of Platteville was Pickett's counsel. Did he carry mail? I thought so. I think he was a substitute.
His son did. Dave Jr.
Okay.
Dave's dad was
That would have been his dad.
Yeah.
Okay, I knew that name. And did he build one of those new out on Gulfview Road there? Did he build one of the first houses that were
And he was a mail carrier that you remember when you were a boy, right?
Yeah.
So, and there's a picture of Pickett, not at his most photogenic anyway, being held for bribery. So he was getting around as a lawyer in this time period. And this is just more of getting continuances. I think Dick had looked for how this Darlington case turned out, but and your guess was that maybe he had just, in the Darlington case, just paid the people back the money he was charged with, and maybe he had bigger fish to fry with these federal charges that eventually sent him to Leavenworth. So there's, this is shamelessly snagged from Getty Images. Anyway, there's Pickett being released, and I forget which one. I have it written down somewhere. But this was one of the charges against Pickett, and he'd won. But eventually he did wind up serving time in Leavenworth for harboring a fugitive, that is Van Meter. Okay, This is a Capital Times article about the only thing different from this article and the other articles is from the Galena Telegraph Herald is they discovered the name was the Big Dick Mine, and the Telegraph Herald didn't like to tell people that. So, but everyone after that, they are talking about this mine. I found it interesting also that at the same time they're doing this, they're talking about whether or not the Ulysses, who some people consider the greatest book of the 20th century, should be suppressed. I mean, it's an interesting tale of the times. But, okay, so this article, could you read it, would be basically exactly the same as the Telegraph Herald article, and it appeared all over the place. Now, a fellow who is very interested in organized crime in Chicago ran a particular blog looking at this fellow was looking at is locations in Chicago where crime occurred in the 30s. So he was focusing in on the plastic surgery that Dillinger had. And hang on, let me get my transcript here. So, of course, Dillinger has been dodging J. Edgar Hoover's agents and Melvin Purvis, if you know of him. This is the place in Chicago on Pulaski, which was Crawford, where Dillinger's plastic surgery was done. And according to this writer, it was Pickett and O'Leary who connected Dillinger with this makeshift operating room, and make that being the operating room. Pickett apparently in April of 1934 approached a low-level crook and bar owner, James Probasco, about finding trained surgeons who could do things like, plastic surgery on the face, but particularly on their fingertips. Probasco was in his 60s then. He did have some medical training in veterinary science and had been part of a diamond theft ring. But anyway, apparently he just saw dollar signs because they knew that Dillinger had a lot of money. So Dillinger paid a lot of money to have acid, for example, put on his fingertips. And Dillinger also learned from this how to do things like when one of his partners in crime, Hamilton, was mortally wounded and died over about a 3-day period. They buried him and they dumped lye on the body so that if anyone found it, they wouldn't know that it was Hamilton. But there's no question that the person that hooked Dillinger up to Probasco, and then the surgeon who did some of the more complicated plastic surgery, a fellow named William Loeser, Loeser, was Pickett. Oh, and here's some quotes from that article. Probasco looked for men with medical training, but were acquainted with the underworld, and found Dr. William Loeser. And you can see at the top there how much they paid. $5,000, which would be about $80,000 in 2009, which is when that was written, so a bit more now. So Dillinger went out and robbed a few more banks to earn the fee. Anyway, to start drawing things to a conclusion here, Louis Pickett did serve time in Leavenworth for harboring fugitives. He got out, he remained living in Chicago. He was eventually granted a pardon from Harry Truman, and he was petitioning to be able to practice law again when he died of a massive heart attack. Here's a local obituary. In the one on the other side over there, it says he graduated from Kent College with a law degree. I don't know which of these are true. He went to some law school, no law school, had a law degree. And
I think Reverend DeRocher must have been pretty young at that time. 1930.
yeah,
That was at his funeral in 1951. He was at Platteville. I don't know.
could you say the name of that person again?
Father DeRocher. He was, I remember him.
So this is just is back to a picture of the mine, and there's, again, lots of other stories. So I know, some of you here might have some, and
I
we'd
was
like.
just gonna add one thing. I think it was probably about 1922 when Louis Pickett made the change from being prosecutor to the other side, where he turned to be a mob lawyer. An interesting note, in 1928, he defended a guy, or he was an attorney for a guy. It was in Chicago. A mobster was getting slot machines back from the police. He was bribing the police to get confiscated slot machines back. And a slot machine mechanic whose name was David C. Roccola, his slot machine mechanic, was going to testify against the mob, and Louis Pickett was his lawyer. And when he came his turn to testify, he took the Fifth Amendment, and the case against the mob fell apart. And this David C. Roccola went on to become a multimillionaire in jukeboxes. And you remember, I always thought Roccola was just kind of a made-up trademark name, but the guy's name was actually Roccola. Remember us old timers remember Roccola jukeboxes?
Yeah, oh, yeah.
I was.
Maybe I would
Yeah.
have something to add.
You brought some information about the death.
I'm sure that. Does anyone know where Louis Pickett's house was?
No.
He lived on Lewis Street.
Oh, really?
Yeah.
Did Louis Pickett had a house in Platteville
Yes,
then?
he had a house in Platteville, and right next door.
Here, let me give this to you.
I was carrying mail in Platteville from 1970 to 2000, so way back when I first started, some of these people still were in this area that knew about this. So anyway, his house was on Lewis Street, and right next door, I can't remember the house number, must be 240, because the one before it is 230, and an elderly lady lived in that house, and I talked to her many times. And she lived there when Louis lived next door, but Louis wasn't there a lot because he was in Chicago. But when he came home, he would stay in his house. Well, she says they called them G-men then. She says they rented a room on the second floor of my house. And then she says, just look around here, you can see the room up, or the window up there that looks right at Louis' house. So he said they would spend, sometimes if they heard that Louis was going to be in town, they would stay upstairs there and just watch him to see if Dillinger might show up.
Could I ask you if it's possible that Dillinger was then coming and staying at his dad's house? Because I noticed on Jefferson Street, when Joseph was on Jefferson, then it showed that his dad, J.D. Pickett, his address on Lewis Street. I don't know if there was like two houses or.
Yeah.
Yeah. Oh, okay.
I wasn't aware that his dad lived on Jefferson Street. That I didn't know. But
Can you narrow that house down? I'm just curious, where would it be from Jefferson Street, where the intersection of Jefferson Street and Lewis, where would it be from the house you're talking about?
okay, if you go up 2nd Street and turn right on Lewis Street.
Turn right, okay.
Okay, go over and then it'd be the house right next. Do you know where John Carpenter lived?
Yeah.
Okay, well it'd be the next house east was Louis' house.
Next house.
Because where John lived is where this elderly lady lived that lived there when Louis lived next door.
It wouldn't quite be to the corner then, it would be maybe the second house from the
Right,
corner.
right,
of
right,
Jefferson.
right.
So, okay.
Yep.
It'd be on the north side of Lewis.
It'd be on the north side, yes. Yep. Well, I have some other things here. I have a good friend from Monroe. His name is Neil Trickle, and he is into all of this gangster stuff. In fact, he owns all the bullets that were shot at the St. Valentine's Day Massacre. I have pictures of them here. He showed them to me. And he has several guns that Dillinger owned, and then the wooden gun that you were talking about that he escaped from Crown Point with. Neil says that he made that himself, carved it in prison, and then he put shoe polish on it to make it look dark, look black. So anyway, I have some things here if anyone would like to look at it. when these gangsters were killed, they always made a death mask of them in the morgue. So Neil also has the original death mask that was made on Dillinger's face. There's a picture of it in here of them doing it to Dillinger. And then Neil brought it to my house. So there's a picture of me actually holding that mask. And there's been several fake ones, I mean reproduction, but this is the original one. He keeps it in a vault in Monroe. It's priceless.
Yeah.
As these bullets are too, from the St. Valentine's Day Massacre.
How did those come into his possession, if I may ask? Did he just bid on them, or did he have some connection?
Pardon me, I'm a little hard of hearing, thanks to the Navy.
Oh, I was just wondering, how did all this stuff come into his possession? That's fascinating.
Into what?
Yeah, how did he
Neil?
come into possession, yeah, of the death mask and these
Okay,
bullets and all that?
this guy is known nationally for his involvement in this stuff. And how he got the bullets for the St. Valentine's Day Massacre, he had a relative that was on the police force in Chicago at the time this happened. So after the massacre was over, the police department, I also have an original copy of the police report of the massacre, all the people in it and everything. Well, anyway, the police department kept these bullets for years and years and years. And then Neil had this friend that was still involved in the police department. They were going to throw them away. So Neil got them from him. And he says, a casino in Las Vegas has offered me an undisclosed amount of money for these bullets. But he said, I'm going to keep them. They don't have any children. He and his wife said, I don't know where they're going to go. Some museum or something, I want to donate them. But anyway, he has such fascinating stories about them. And he came here one time and I showed him where Louis Pickett is buried, took him down Jenkinsville, showed him where that mine was. And I didn't know about this Red School mine though. Where is that? Where's this?
If you, you know where the Red School was?
No, I don't.
Okay, if you were to go to Darlington on Highway 81.
Okay.
And turn south at Red Supper Club.
Okay, well, that's
on
go to-
County H, I believe it is.
Mm-hmm.
And the first crossroads is St.
Mhm.
Peter Road.
Yep.
The second crossroad is Red School Road.
Okay.
And right at that junction
Yeah.
of H and Red School Road,
Mhm.
it was where the Red School was on the
Okay.
west side of the road, and where that playground is still there.
Okay, okay.
But if you were to go east on Red School Road, then on your left, just a little ways around the corner there, there's that picture where Terry showed you of the trees that grow there was where that
Where
Big
that-
Dick mine, there was a Big Dick 1 and a Big Dick 2 mine, I think they were
Mhm.
connected.
Yeah, okay.
And that's where
Okay,
that-
I knew where the mine was and all that, but I didn't know where that,
Yeah.
about the Red School, but that's interesting. But anyway, I can bring this stuff up to the table here if someone would like to look at it. I have more information too from Neil. He's just a terrific guy. And he's coming back here again too this summer to visit. If anybody would like to hook up with him, he'd be happy to come in here and share his stories.
Yeah, maybe you can get into.
Yeah, I'll sure do that. I'll contact him. Bill told me
Give
about
Terry a
this
hand
today.
for all the work she's done on this.
Yes.
This has been a lot of
I can verify Ivan was a good mailman.
Oh.
I haven't seen it. I didn't recognize it.
I thought that was your head.
Should I turn this back over to you, Bill?
When you started talking.
Let's talk about your mustache for a little bit.
Okay.
Get up close to the camera.
I don't know how this is gonna come out on Facebook or YouTube, but we'll work on it. And in 2 more weeks, we're gonna have a presentation. I forgot what.
We're talking about, what are we talking about, Laura? Alexander Hamilton Willard.
Yes.
We'll just cut this part off because I'm losing my street cred fast.
Alexander Hamilton Willard.
Lewis and Clark.
And the Lewis and
Yes,
Clark.
from the Lewis and Clark expedition from Platteville.
Awesome.
See you in 2 weeks.
Thanks, York.